The sound of a shotgun blast pierced the early morning stillness, followed by the desperate scream of a woman who had nothing left to lose. Hazel Montgomery stood on the creaking porch of her small homestead, the smoking barrel of her father's old shotgun still aimed at the retreating figures of the three men who'd been threatening her for weeks. It was 1878 in the harsh territory of Wyoming, and a woman alone might as well have been wearing a target on her back. "And don't come back," she shouted, her voice breaking as she lowered the weapon. Her hands trembled violently as the adrenaline coursed through her body. She hadn't hit any of them, hadn't truly aimed to, but the warning shot had done its job. For now, Hazel slumped against the rough, hewn doorframe of the cabin her late husband had built with his own hands. 6 months a widow, and it seemed the whole world was determined to drive her off the modest patch of land she called home. First Thomas dying of pneumonia after that terrible winter storm, then the drought killing half her crops, and now these men working for the cattle baron who wanted to expand his already vast empire. At 24, Hazel found herself utterly alone. No children had blessed their 3-year marriage, though not for lack of trying. Now her arms felt as empty as the cabin behind her, as empty as the promises the territory had made about a better life out west. She brushed a strand of auburn hair from her face and squared her shoulders. The morning chores wouldn't wait, threats or no threats. The 2 remaining chickens needed feeding, and there was water to haul. She'd need to ride into town soon for supplies, though the thought of facing the pitying glances and not-so-subtle marriage proposals from men twice her age made her stomach turn. The sun was climbing higher when Hazel spotted a cloud of dust in the distance. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she hurried inside for the shotgun again. If Harlan's men were returning so soon, she'd need to be ready. But as the rider drew closer, she realized it wasn't any of the men from earlier. This was a lone figure, tall in the saddle, riding a magnificent chestnut stallion. She kept the shotgun ready nonetheless, stepping out onto the porch as the stranger approached. "That's far enough," she called when the rider was within earshot. "State your business." The man pulled his horse to a stop, raising his hands slightly to show he meant no harm. "Madam, I don't want any trouble. Name's Isaac Blackwood. My horse picked up a stone about 3 miles back, and he's favoring that hoof something fierce. I noticed your place and thought you might have a pail of water I could use to clean it out." Hazel studied him carefully. He was younger than she'd first thought, probably not much older than her own 24 years. Dust covered his denim trousers and blue cotton shirt, and a well-worn brown Stetson shadowed eyes that seemed honest enough from this distance. A gun belt hung around his hips, but that was nothing unusual for a man traveling alone in these parts. "You can water your horse at the trough," she said finally, though she didn't lower the shotgun. "But keep your hands where I can see them." Isaac nodded slowly. "Yes, madam." He dismounted with the easy grace of a man who'd spent most of his life in the saddle, then led his horse to the water trough beside the small barn. Hazel watched him check the animal's front right hoof, speaking to it in low, soothing tones. There was something in the gentle way he handled the horse that made her relax slightly, though she maintained her vigilant stance. A good horseman usually wasn't the worst sort of man. "You had some trouble here earlier?" he asked casually, not looking up from his task. "Thought I heard a shot when I was still a ways off." Hazel's grip tightened on the shotgun. "Nothing I couldn't handle." Isaac glanced up then, and for the first time, she got a clear look at his face. Strong jaw covered with several days' worth of dark stubble, straight nose, and eyes the color of a summer sky. A small scar cut through his right eyebrow, and the beginning of smile lines creased the corners of his eyes. "Didn't say you couldn't," he replied, a hint of admiration in his voice. "Not many women would stand their ground alone out here." "I don't have much choice," she answered before she could stop herself. Isaac nodded as if he understood perfectly. He returned his attention to his horse, lifting the hoof again and working carefully to remove the stone. When he finished, he straightened and dusted off his hands. "Thank you for the water, Mrs. Montgomery." "Hazel Montgomery." She hesitated, then added, "My husband's been dead 6 months now." Something flickered in Isaac's eyes, not the predatory interest she'd grown accustomed to seeing in men's faces when they learned she was a widow, but something more like genuine sympathy. "I'm sorry to hear that, Mrs. Montgomery." He glanced at the small homestead, taking in the unmended fence, the the garden struggling against the dry summer, and the weathered barn that needed fresh paint. Can't be easy managing all this alone. I manage just fine, she said, lifting her chin defiantly. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. I can see that. He ran a hand along his horse's neck. Storm here seems to be stepping better now. I appreciate your hospitality. He should have mounted up and ridden away then, and Hazel should have been glad to see him go. But something, perhaps the long months of solitude or the frightening confrontation earlier that morning, made her speak. Mr. Blackwood, if you're hungry, I've got some stew left from last night. Least I can do for a traveler. The surprise on his face was evident, and he seemed to consider the offer carefully. That's mighty kind, but I wouldn't want to impose. It's just a bowl of stew, she said, finally lowering the shotgun to her side. And I'd appreciate hearing news from wherever you've come from. The truth was, she was desperate for conversation that didn't involve threats or unwanted advances. This stranger seemed decent enough, and her instincts usually served her well. Isaac nodded. In that case, I accept with thanks. He secured his horse to the hitching post and followed Hazel inside the cabin, removing his hat as he crossed the threshold. The interior was small but neat, with a table and 2 chairs, a cast-iron stove, and a curtained-off area that presumably led to her sleeping quarters. You can wash up there, she said, gesturing to a basin of water she'd drawn earlier that morning. She placed the shotgun within easy reach as she moved to the stove to reheat the stew. Isaac rolled up his sleeves and washed his hands and face, the cool water a blessed relief after miles of dusty travel. When he turned back, he noticed a framed tintype photograph on a small shelf, a wedding portrait of Hazel and a young man with kind eyes and a serious expression. Your husband? He asked gently. Hazel glanced up from stirring the stew. Yes, Thomas. We came out here from Illinois 3 years ago. He thought we'd make our fortune. A sad smile touched her lips. We were young and full of dreams. Those dreams don't have to die with him, Isaac said quietly. She met his gaze, something stirring in her chest at the sincerity in his eyes. Maybe not, but they get a lot harder to hold on to. They ate at the small table, and true to his word, Isaac shared news from his travels. He'd been working as a ranch hand in Colorado, but was heading north to Montana where his uncle had some property. I've been saving to buy my own spread someday, he explained between spoonfuls of the rabbit stew. Not looking for anything grand, just enough good grazing land for a modest herd, a solid cabin, maybe a creek running through it. Sounds like what Thomas and I wanted, Hazel said. This place could have been that, with time and work. It still could be, Isaac observed. The soil looks good, even with the drought. And your location here with the foothills as a backdrop, it's prime. Prime enough that Harlan Wilkes wants it for himself, she said bitterly. His men were the ones who paid me a visit this morning. Isaac's expression darkened. Wilkes? The cattle baron who owns half the valley? Hazel nodded. He's been trying to buy me out since Thomas died. Keeps lowballing his offers, knowing I'm struggling. She pushed her bowl away, her appetite diminishing at the thought. This morning, his men suggested I might have an accident if I don't reconsider. That's why you had the shotgun ready, Isaac said, understanding dawning in his eyes. Yes, and they'll be back. Men like that always come back. Isaac was quiet for a moment, considering her words. I could stay a few days, he offered suddenly. Help with some repairs, keep an eye out. I'm not due in Montana until the end of the month anyway. Hazel stared at him, suspicious. Why would you do that? You don't know me. My pa raised me to help folks in need, he said simply. And it seems to me you could use an extra pair of hands around here, just until you get those fences mended and maybe put the fear of God into Wilkes's men. She wanted to refuse, to prove she could handle everything herself. But the truth was, she was exhausted from constant vigilance, from the backbreaking work, from the loneliness. I can pay you a little, she said finally. Not much, but Isaac shook his head. I don't want your money, Mrs. Montgomery. A place to lay my bedroll and meals while I'm here is payment enough. Call me Hazel, she said after a moment. If you're staying, Mrs. Montgomery is too formal. Hazel, he repeated, and something about the way her name sounded in his deep voice made her cheeks warm unexpectedly. That evening, Isaac insisted on sleeping in the barn despite Hazel's offer of the small enclosed porch. I've slept under the stars more nights than I can count, he assured her. The barn is practically a palace compared to some places. As she prepared for bed, Hazel found herself glancing repeatedly toward the barn, visible through her small window. There was something comforting about knowing someone else was on the property, someone who seemed genuinely concerned for her welfare. It had been so long since she'd felt anything but alone. She fell asleep that night without checking that the shotgun was loaded beside her bed the first time since Thomas had died. The next morning, Hazel woke to the smell of coffee brewing and the sound of hammering. Confused, she dressed quickly and hurried outside to find Isaac already hard at work repairing the broken slats in her front porch. "Hope I didn't wake you," he said, pausing in his work. "Found some lumber in your barn that looked like it was meant for repairs. Thomas cut those boards last fall," she said, surprisingly touched that the materials were finally being put to use. "He never got around to fixing the porch before he got sick." Isaac nodded in understanding. "Coffee's hot if you want some. I took the liberty of getting a fire going in the stove." Throughout the day, Isaac tackled one repair after another: the porch, the chicken coop, the loose boards on the barn. Hazel worked alongside him when she could, between tending her garden and preparing meals. They fell into an easy rhythm together, and she found herself sharing stories about her life with Thomas, about her childhood in Illinois, about her dreams for the homestead. Isaac was a good listener, offering thoughts and experiences of his own without dominating the conversation. He told her about growing up on a small farm in Missouri, about losing his mother to influenza when he was 14, about working cattle drives and ranch jobs across 3 territories. "You've seen a lot more of the world than I have," Hazel remarked as they sat on the newly repaired porch that evening, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains gold and crimson. "Maybe so," Isaac replied, "but you've built something real here. That's worth more than all my wandering." 3 days passed in this manner, and with each sunrise, Hazel found herself looking forward to Isaac's company more eagerly. There was an ease between them that she hadn't expected, a natural companionship that made the work lighter, and the hours passed swiftly. On the 4th day, they were mending the fence line along the eastern edge of her property when 3 riders appeared on the ridge. Hazel recognized them immediately: Wilkes's men, the same ones who had threatened her before. "Looks like we've got company," Isaac said quietly, setting down his tools and subtly shifting to stand slightly in front of her. The men approached slowly, and Hazel could see their surprise at finding her not alone. The leader, a burly man with a face like weathered leather, pulled his horse to a stop several yards away. "Mrs. Montgomery," he said, tipping his hat with mock politeness. "I see you've hired help." "Just passing through," Isaac replied before Hazel could speak. "Staying a spell to help a neighbor in need." The man's eyes narrowed. "Don't recall seeing you around these parts before. Don't recall having to explain myself to you," Isaac said pleasantly, though Hazel could hear the steel beneath his casual tone. The second rider, a thin man with a pockmarked face, leaned forward in his saddle. "Mr. Wilkes sent us to check if you'd reconsidered his offer, Mrs. Montgomery. He's a patient man, but his patience is wearing thin." "My answer hasn't changed," Hazel said firmly. "This land isn't for sale, not to Mr. Wilkes, not to anyone." The third rider, younger than the others but with cold eyes that made Hazel's skin crawl, spat on the ground. "Shame if something happened to your livestock. Wolf's been bad this year, I hear." Isaac's hand moved casually to rest on his gun belt. "Funny thing about wolves," he said, his voice deceptively light. "They usually know better than to hunt on protected land." He stared directly at the young rider. "The smart ones, anyway." A tense silence fell over the group. Hazel could feel her heart pounding, but she stood her ground beside Isaac, drawing strength from his calm presence. Finally, the leader jerked his head at his companions. "We'll be sure to tell Mr. Wilkes you've got assistance now." His gaze shifted to Isaac, temporary as it might be. With that parting remark, they wheeled their horses around and rode off, but not before casting threatening glances over their shoulders. When they were out of sight, Hazel released a shaky breath. "They'll be back, with more men next time." Isaac turned to her, his expression grave. "Likely so, but they'll think twice now that they know you're not alone." He hesitated, then added, "I should teach you to shoot that shotgun properly. A warning shot's fine, but if it comes to it, you need to be able to defend yourself." Hazel nodded, grateful for his practical approach rather than empty reassurances. "Thomas tried to teach me once, but I was never very good at it. We'll work on that tomorrow, Isaac promised. For now, let's finish this fence. That night, as they ate supper, Hazel found herself studying Isaac's face in the warm glow of the oil lamp. In just a few days, his presence had become something she counted on, something that made her feel secure in a way she hadn't since Thomas died, perhaps even before that. "What will you do when you leave for Montana?" she asked suddenly. Isaac looked up from his plate, seeming startled by the question. "I'm not sure anymore," he admitted. "Plans have a way of changing when you least expect it." Their eyes met across the table, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition of the connection that had formed, unexpected and unplanned. The next morning, Isaac took Hazel to a clearing behind the barn to practice shooting. He was a patient teacher, showing her how to hold the shotgun properly, how to brace for the recoil, how to aim at different distances. "You're a natural," he said with admiration after she hit 3 cans in a row. "Just needed the right instruction." Hazel couldn't help the proud smile that spread across her face. "It feels good to know I can protect myself." "Yes," Isaac agreed, his expression softening as he looked at her. "But I hope you never have to." That afternoon, they rode into town together for supplies. Hazel had been avoiding the trip, dreading the gossip and unwanted attention, but with Isaac beside her, she felt more confident. The small settlement of Pine Creek consisted of a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, and a handful of other buildings strung along a dusty main street. As they tied their horses outside the general store, Hazel was acutely aware of the curious glances from townspeople. "Ignore them," Isaac murmured, placing a gentle hand at the small of her back as they entered the store. The proprietary gesture wasn't lost on the storekeeper or the 2 women examining fabric at the counter, and Hazel knew that by nightfall, everyone in town would be talking about the widow Montgomery and her handsome companion. Strangely, she found she didn't mind. "Mrs. Montgomery, good to see you in town." The storekeeper, Mr. Peterson, greeted her. His gaze shifted to Isaac with open curiosity. "And who might your friend be?" "Isaac Blackwood," Isaac replied, extending his hand. "Just helping Mrs. Montgomery with some repairs on her place." "Mr. Peterson shook his hand, his expression calculating. "Passing through, are you?" Before Isaac could answer, the door opened, and a large man in an expensive suit entered, flanked by 2 of the riders who had confronted them at the fence line. Hazel's stomach clenched. Harlan Wilkes himself, looking every bit the powerful cattle baron in his tailored clothes and polished boots. "Mrs. Montgomery," Wilkes said, his voice oily smooth. "What a pleasant surprise." His cold eyes assessed Isaac. "And who's this?" "This is Mr. Blackwood," Hazel said, lifting her chin. "A friend who's staying with me for a while." Wilkes raised an eyebrow. "Is that so? Strange. I don't recall seeing Mr. Blackwood around these parts before." He turned his attention fully to Isaac. "What brings you to our little corner of Wyoming, Mr. Blackwood?" "Just passing through," Isaac said easily. "Found Mrs. Montgomery could use some help, so I offered my services." "How charitable of you." Wilkes's tone made the words sound like an insult. He returned his gaze to Hazel. "I hope your friend has advised you to consider my offer, Mrs. Montgomery. $1,500 is more than fair for that parcel. That land is worth at least 3 times that amount, and you know it," Isaac interjected calmly. Wilkes's eyes narrowed. "I don't believe I was addressing you, sir." "Mr. Wilkes," Hazel said firmly, "as I've told your men repeatedly, my land is not for sale. Not now, not ever." The storekeeper and the 2 women had fallen silent, watching the exchange with wide eyes. Wilkes seemed acutely aware of the audience, and after a moment, he forced a thin smile. "Perhaps we can discuss this another time," he said. "When you're not distracted by company." With a curt nod, he turned and left the store, his men following in his wake. Mr. Peterson let out a low whistle when the door closed. "You're playing with fire, Mrs. Montgomery." Wilkes isn't known for taking no for an answer. "Neither am I," Hazel replied, turning back to her shopping list with determined focus. As they loaded their supplies into Hazel's wagon later, Isaac helped her up onto the seat, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. "You were brave in there," he said quietly. Hazel looked down at him, suddenly aware of how close they were standing. "I had good backup." Something flickered in Isaac's eyes, a warmth that made her breath catch. But he simply nodded, and moved around to climb up beside her. The ride back to the homestead was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts. The confrontation with Wilkes had changed something, made the threat more real. It also highlighted the temporary nature of Isaac's presence. He would leave eventually, and she would be alone again to face whatever came. As if reading her thoughts, Isaac spoke. "I've been thinking about staying longer than I'd planned." Hazel's heart skipped a beat. "What about your uncle in Montana?" "He's not expecting me on any particular date," Isaac said, keeping his eyes on the road ahead. "And I'm concerned about Wilkes. Men like him don't give up easily." "I can't ask you to put your life on hold for me," Hazel said, though everything in her wanted him to stay. Isaac glanced at her then, his expression serious. "You're not asking. I'm offering." That evening, as Hazel prepared supper, she found herself moving around the kitchen with a lightness she hadn't felt in months. The idea of Isaac staying longer filled her with a quiet joy she wasn't ready to examine too closely. They ate by lamplight, discussing the repairs still needed and plans for improving the garden's irrigation. It felt domestic, comfortable, as if they'd been doing this for years instead of days. After the meal, Isaac helped her clean up, their hands occasionally brushing as they passed dishes between them. Each accidental touch sent a small thrill through Hazel, and she caught herself seeking out those moments of contact. "I should turn in," she said finally, when the kitchen was spotless and there was no reason to linger. "Tomorrow will be another busy day." Isaac nodded, but neither of them moved. They stood facing each other in the small kitchen, the lamplight casting a golden glow over his features. Hazel found herself memorizing the lines of his face, the exact shade of his eyes, the way his hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck. "Hazel," he said softly, her name like a caress on his lips. "Yes?" she whispered, hardly daring to breathe. He took a step closer, then seemed to catch himself. "Nothing. Just sleep well." Disappointment flooded her, though she knew it was for the best. Whatever was growing between them was complicated by her recent widowhood, by his transient lifestyle, by the threats hanging over her homestead. "Good night, Isaac," she said, retreating to her bedroom with confused emotions swirling in her chest. The next week passed in a blur of productive days and increasingly comfortable evenings. Isaac continued to sleep in the barn despite Hazel's suggestion that the enclosed porch would be more comfortable. "Better for your reputation," he'd said with a wry smile, though they both knew her reputation in town was already the subject of gossip. They fell into a routine that felt natural, sharing morning coffee before tackling the day's work, taking meals together, talking long into the evening. Isaac told her more about his dreams of having his own ranch someday, and Hazel shared her hopes of making the homestead profitable enough to be truly independent. What remained unspoken was the growing attraction between them. It manifested in lingering glances, in the way Isaac's hand would rest briefly on her shoulder as he passed, and how Hazel found herself making excuses to be near him. Then came the night that changed everything. Hazel woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of shouting. Disoriented, she stumbled from bed and rushed to the window. In the moonlight, she could see flames licking at the corner of the barn. "Isaac!" she screamed, terror seizing her as she grabbed her shawl and ran outside. The barn door burst open, and Isaac emerged, leading his frightened horse. "Get water," he shouted, pushing the reins into her hands before rushing back inside. Heart pounding, Hazel secured the horse to a fence post and ran for the well. She worked the pump frantically, filling a bucket while keeping her eyes fixed on the barn. The fire was growing, consuming the dry wood with hungry orange flames. Just as she turned with the heavy bucket, Isaac appeared again, this time leading her mare and carrying his saddle and bedroll. "The back corner's fully engulfed," he called. "We need to get the animals clear." Together they worked to save what they could: the horses, Hazel's 2 milk cows, the chickens. The fire spread relentlessly, and soon it became clear that the barn couldn't be saved. They focused instead on keeping the flames from reaching the cabin, forming a bucket brigade of 2 that left them soaked and exhausted. It was nearly dawn when the fire finally burned itself out, leaving nothing but smoking ruins where the barn had stood. Hazel sank to her knees in the dirt, overcome with despair. Isaac knelt beside her, his face streaked with soot, his clothing singed in places. "This was Wilkes," she said, her voice hollow. "He's trying to drive me out." Isaac nodded grimly. I found a broken lantern near where the fire started. It was deliberate. Anger surged through her, hot and fierce. I won't let him win. I won't be driven from my home. We'll rebuild, Isaac said firmly, taking her hands in his. But Hazel, this is getting dangerous. He could have killed us both tonight. She looked up at him, suddenly struck by his use of we and the intensity in his eyes. Why are you still here, Isaac? You could ride away from all this trouble. He held her gaze steadily. Because I can't leave you to face this alone. But why? She pressed, needing to hear him say what she suspected what she hoped was true. Isaac's thumb brushed over her knuckles, a gentle caress that sent warmth through her despite her exhaustion. Because in the short time I've known you, Hazel Montgomery, you've become more important to me than any destination or plan I ever made. The confession hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable. Hazel felt tears spring to her eyes, not from sadness, but from a rush of emotion so powerful it left her breathless. Isaac, she whispered, not knowing what else to say. He released one of her hands to brush a smudge of ash from her cheek, his touch lingering. I know it's too soon. I know you're still grieving Thomas. But I can't pretend I don't feel something for you, something I wasn't looking for, but found anyway. Hazel leaned into his touch, closing her eyes briefly. I feel it too, she admitted. And it scares me. We don't have to name it, Isaac said softly. We don't have to decide anything now. But I want you to know that whatever comes next with Wilkes, with the homestead, you're not alone anymore. She opened her eyes to find him watching her with such tenderness that it made her heart ache. Without overthinking, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his in a gentle, questioning kiss. Isaac responded with equal gentleness, his hand sliding to cup the back of her neck, drawing her closer. The kiss deepened, becoming something more, a promise, a beginning, a defiance against all the loss and hardship that had come before. When they finally pulled apart, both slightly breathless, Isaac rested his forehead against hers. We should get some rest, he murmured. Tomorrow, we start rebuilding. The next day, they began clearing the charred remains of the barn. It was grueling, filthy work, but they tackled it together, stopping only when necessary to tend to the animals or take brief meals. As they worked, they discussed plans for a new barn, smaller but sturdier, with better ventilation and a stone foundation. Isaac sketched ideas in the dirt, incorporating features he'd seen on successful ranches across the territories. You're talking as if you'll be here to build it, Hazel observed, watching him outline the dimensions of the stable area. Isaac looked up, his expression open and honest. I'd like to be, if you want me to stay. The simplicity of his statement belied its significance. He was offering to change his plans completely, to set aside his journey to Montana in favor of putting down roots here with her. What about your uncle's land? Your dream of your own ranch? She asked. Dreams can change, he said quietly. Or maybe they just get clearer. When I talked about wanting my own spread, what I really wanted was a home. A place that matters. People who matter. He met her eyes steadily. I found that here. Hazel's heart swelled with emotion. I want you to stay, she said, her voice stronger than she expected. Not just to help with the barn or to deal with Wilkes. I want you to stay because she faltered, the words catching in her throat. Isaac stepped closer, taking her soot-stained hands in his. You don't have to say it, he assured her. Not until you're ready. But Hazel shook her head. No, I need to say it. Since Thomas died, I felt so empty. Like there was nothing left of me but grief and determination to hold on to this land. But you filled that emptiness, Isaac. Not by replacing what I lost, but by showing me I could feel again, that I could look forward instead of just hanging on. Isaac's eyes shone with emotion as he listened, his hands tightening around hers. I love you, she said finally, the words both frightening and liberating. I didn't expect to, and maybe it's happened faster than is proper, but it's true all the same. Hazel, he breathed, pulling her into his arms. I love you too. Have almost since that first day, when you stood on your porch with that shotgun, looking like the bravest woman I'd ever seen. Their kiss was different this time, deeper, more certain, filled with the promise of a future neither had anticipated but both now embraced. When they separated, Hazel felt a sense of rightness settle in her chest, as if the final piece of a puzzle had fallen into place. Now we have even more reason to stand our ground against Wilkes, she said, determination hardening her voice. Isaac nodded, his expression serious once more. We need to be smart about this. He's escalated to arson, there's no telling what he might try next. They spent the afternoon continuing the cleanup, both aware that their confession had changed things between them in the best possible way. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Isaac brought up a subject that had been on his mind. We should get married, he said without preamble. Hazel turned to him in surprise. Isaac, we've only known each other 2 weeks. I know, he acknowledged with a small smile. And if circumstances were different, I'd court you properly, take you on buggy rides, bring you flowers, ask permission from your father. But Wilkes is getting desperate, and being husband and wife would give us legal protection that we don't have now. What do you mean? Hazel asked. If something happened to you, as your husband, I could inherit this land and keep it from Wilkes. And if something happened to me? He trailed off, his expression growing somber. Well, at least you wouldn't be alone in the eyes of the law. You'd have rights that a friend couldn't provide. Hazel considered his words, recognizing the practical wisdom in them. But still, she hesitated. Is that the only reason you're proposing? For legal protection? Isaac took her hand, bringing it to his lips. No, he said softly. I'm proposing because I love you and want to build a life with you. The timing is rushed because of Wilkes, but the feeling behind it is as real as anything I've ever known. Hazel looked into his earnest blue eyes and knew he spoke the truth. And in her heart, she knew her answer. Yes, she said simply. I'll marry you, Isaac Blackwood. His face broke into a radiant smile, and he pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. We'll ride into town tomorrow, he said against her hair. Find the justice of the peace. That night, Isaac slept on the enclosed porch rather than making a temporary shelter near where the barn had been. It was still a proper distance, but close enough that Hazel felt secure knowing he was just outside her door. The next morning, they dressed in their cleanest clothes and rode into Pine Creek side by side. The town was already abuzz with news of the barn fire, and curious eyes followed them as they made their way to the Justice of the Peace's office. Judge Wilson was a gruff man in his 60s who had been serving the county for decades. He listened with shrewd attention as they explained their intention to marry. This have anything to do with your barn burning down, Mrs. Montgomery? He asked bluntly. It has everything to do with the fact that we love each other, Hazel replied with equal directness. The judge studied them both for a long moment, then nodded. I can perform the ceremony this afternoon. Need 2 witnesses. Mr. Peterson from the general store might be willing, Isaac suggested. And perhaps the blacksmith? I'll send my clerk to ask them, Judge Wilson said. Come back at 3 o'clock. As they left the office, Hazel felt a curious mixture of nerves and certainty. She was about to marry a man she'd known for only 2 weeks, something she would have considered scandalous before meeting Isaac. Yet somehow, it felt right in a way that defied conventional timing. Are you sure about this? Isaac asked as they walked toward the general store to purchase supplies. Hazel squeezed his hand. Yes. Are you? More sure than I've ever been about anything, he affirmed, his smile warming her from the inside out. The news of their impending marriage spread through town like wildfire. By the time they returned to Judge Wilson's office at 3 o'clock, it seemed half the town had found excuses to be nearby, hoping to catch a glimpse of the widow Montgomery and her whirlwind romance. The ceremony itself was brief but meaningful. Mr. Peterson and the blacksmith, Mr. Dawson, served as witnesses, both men offering hearty congratulations afterward. Hazel wore a simple blue dress, not her Sunday best, which had been Thomas's favorite, but one that felt right for this new chapter in her life. Isaac had splurged on a new shirt at the general store, and he'd gotten a proper shave at the barber's while Hazel had picked out a few necessities. When Judge Wilson pronounced them husband and wife, Isaac kissed her with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. It was a moment of pure joy amid all the challenges they faced, a declaration that whatever came next, they would face it together. They were leaving the judge's office, still glowing with the newness of their union, when they encountered Harlan Wilkes on the street. He took in their formal attire and the small gathering of well-wishers with narrowed eyes. "What's this?" he demanded, though it was clear he already knew. "Mr. Wilkes," Isaac said, his arm protective around Hazel's waist, "allow me to introduce my wife, Mrs. Hazel Blackwood." Wilkes's face darkened with anger. This is a transparent ploy, he spat. You think marriage will protect your claim on that land? The land belongs to both of us now, Hazel said calmly. And we have no intention of selling it, not now, not ever. Wilkes stepped closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. You burned down my barn, Hazel accused, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Prove it, Wilkes sneered. He looked at Isaac with contempt. Enjoy your honeymoon, Blackwood. It may be shorter than you expect. With that, he strode away, leaving a chill in his wake despite the warm afternoon sun. Don't let him spoil this day, Isaac said, turning Hazel to face him. He's desperate now, which means we're winning. Hazel nodded, trying to recapture the joy of the moment. You're right. This is our day. They spent another hour in town, accepting congratulations from townsfolk who seemed genuinely pleased for them, whether out of true goodwill or simply enjoyment of the drama. It was hard to tell. Then they mounted their horses and rode back to the homestead as husband and wife. That evening, Hazel prepared a special supper with some of the provisions they'd purchased in town: canned peaches, real coffee, and even a small bottle of wine that Isaac had splurged on as a wedding gift. The tension of the day's encounter with Wilkes gradually faded as they ate by lamplight, talking about their plans for rebuilding and improvements to the homestead. There was an underlying current of awareness between them, the knowledge that tonight, everything would change. When the meal was finished and the dishes washed, Isaac took Hazel's hand. I know this isn't the wedding night most brides dream of, he said softly. No fancy hotel, not even a proper barn roof over our heads. Hazel reached up to touch his face, tracing the line of his jaw with gentle fingers. It's perfect because you're here, she whispered. The rest is just details. Their kiss was tender at first, then deepened with a passion that had been building since they met. Isaac swept her into his arms and carried her to the bedroom, where he laid her on the bed with reverence before joining her. In the quiet darkness, they discovered each other fully for the first time, their bodies expressing what words could not: the depth of their connection, the promise of a future together, the healing of past wounds. For Hazel, who had feared she might never feel complete again after Thomas's death, it was a revelation to discover that her heart had room for this new love, different but equally powerful. And as she lay in Isaac's arms afterward, listening to the steady beat of his heart, she felt truly at peace for the first time in months. Her arms, once empty with grief, were filled now with the warmth and strength of the man who had come into her life when she least expected it but needed it most. The next morning, they woke as husband and wife, the reality of their new status both strange and wonderful. Isaac kissed her deeply before they reluctantly rose to face the day's work. There was still much to do: animals to tend, repairs to make, plans for the new barn to finalize. As they shared breakfast, Hazel couldn't help but marvel at how quickly life could change. 3 weeks ago, she had been alone and besieged, fighting a losing battle against Wilkes and the elements. Now she had a partner, a protector, a lover, someone who believed in her strength while offering his own in support. What are you thinking about? Isaac asked, noticing her contemplative expression. How different everything is now, she replied honestly. How I never expected any of this. He reached across the table to take her hand. Are you happy with the changes? Happier than I thought possible, she assured him, squeezing his fingers. But also worried. Wilkes won't give up easily. Isaac's expression grew serious. No, he won't. We need to be prepared for whatever comes next. They spent the morning laying out the foundation for the new barn, marking corners and clearing additional debris. Around midday, they heard the sound of approaching horses, multiple riders by the sound of it. Isaac straightened, hand moving instinctively to his gun belt. Get inside, he told Hazel. Keep the shotgun ready. But Hazel stood her ground. We face this together, she said firmly. This is our home. After a moment, Isaac nodded, recognizing the determination in her eyes. They moved to stand side by side on the porch, watching as 5 riders crested the hill: Wilkes and 4 of his men. Quite the welcoming committee, Isaac murmured as the group approached. Wilkes pulled his horse to a stop, a respectful distance from the house, his men flanking him. Blackwood, he called. I've come to make one final offer. We're not interested, Isaac replied evenly. $2,000. Wilkes continued as if Isaac hadn't spoken. More than generous for this patch of dirt. This patch of dirt sits on the best water source for miles, Hazel countered. And you know it. Wilkes's expression hardened. Don't be fools. You can't win against me. We're not trying to win against you, Mr. Wilkes, Isaac said. We're simply living our lives on our own land. If you're so desperate for water access, perhaps we could discuss reasonable grazing rights for a fair annual fee. The suggestion clearly caught Wilkes off guard. He hadn't expected negotiation. What kind of fee? He asked after a moment. $300 a year for limited access to the creek on our northern boundary, Isaac proposed. Your cattle can water there, but the land remains ours. Wilkes considered this, clearly torn between his desire for complete control and the practical advantage of the offer. 200, he countered. 250, Isaac said firmly. And a signed agreement that you recognize our ownership of this property and will cease all attempts to acquire it. The tension in the air was palpable as Wilkes deliberated. His men shifted uncomfortably in their saddles, perhaps surprised by the turn the confrontation had taken. I'll have my lawyer draw up an agreement, Wilkes said finally. But know this: if you ever decide to sell, I get first right of refusal. Agreed, Isaac said. As long as you understand we have no intention of selling. Wilkes nodded curtly. I'll return tomorrow with the paperwork. With that, he turned his horse and rode away, his men following close behind. When they were out of sight, Hazel turned to Isaac in amazement. How did you know he would agree to that? Isaac smiled, pulling her into his arms. I didn't. But men like Wilkes understand business, even when they're blinded by pride. Water rights are valuable, and he knows it's cheaper to pay for access than to keep fighting us or try to dig his own wells. Do you think he'll honor the agreement? Hazel asked, still skeptical. Once it's in writing and filed with the county, he'll have to, Isaac assured her. He's got too much at stake in this community to risk his reputation on a broken contract. Hazel leaned into his embrace, relief washing over her. So it's over? Just like that? The worst of it, yes, Isaac said, pressing a kiss to her forehead. Now we can focus on building our life together without looking over our shoulders. True to his word, Wilkes returned the next day with legal papers that granted his cattle access to the creek in exchange for an annual payment of $250. Isaac read the document carefully before he and Hazel signed it, ensuring there were no hidden clauses that might compromise their ownership. The transaction was brief and businesslike, with none of the threats or tension of their previous encounters. When it was complete, Wilkes tipped his hat, a gesture that stopped short of friendliness but acknowledged a certain respect. Smart bargaining, Blackwood, he said as he prepared to leave. If you ever tire of farming, there might be a place for you in my operation. Isaac smiled politely. I appreciate the offer, Mr. Wilkes, but I found exactly where I belong. In the weeks that followed, Isaac and Hazel settled into their life together. With the threat from Wilkes neutralized, they could focus on rebuilding and improving the homestead. The new barn took shape steadily, stronger and more practical than the original. Isaac's experience working on various ranches proved invaluable as they implemented better systems for irrigation and animal care. The first payment from Wilkes arrived promptly, providing capital for additional improvements. Isaac used some of the money to purchase 2 young steers, the beginning of what he hoped would eventually become a small but profitable herd. As summer gave way to fall, the homestead flourished under their combined efforts. The garden yielded a bountiful harvest that Hazel preserved for the winter months ahead. Isaac hunted deer and elk, ensuring their smokehouse was well stocked with meat. They worked hard from sunrise to sunset most days, but their labor was lightened by their growing love and the satisfaction of seeing their efforts bear fruit. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch and watch the sunset, planning for the future, a future that now seemed full of promise rather than struggle. One crisp autumn evening, as they sat wrapped in a quilt against the growing chill, Hazel turned to Isaac with a smile that held a secret. I have something to tell you, she said, taking his hand and placing it gently over her still flat stomach. We're going to have a baby. Isaac's eyes widened, joy spreading across his face like sunrise. A baby? Are you sure? Hazel nodded, her own happiness mirrored in his expression. The midwife in town confirmed it yesterday when you were meeting with Mr. Dawson about the forge. She thinks the baby will come in late spring. Isaac gathered her in his arms, holding her as if she were made of the most precious glass. Hazel, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I never thought I could be this happy. As winter descended on the homestead, bringing snow and bitter winds, Isaac and Hazel found warmth in their small cabin and in their growing love. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, and Hazel's body changed with the passing months, her slender frame softening as the new life within her developed. Isaac was attentive and protective, insisting on taking over the more strenuous chores despite Hazel's protests that she wasn't an invalid. He built a cradle from pine wood, carefully sanding each piece until it was satin smooth, and lined it with the softest fabric they could find. Christmas was a simple but joyous affair, with a small pine tree cut from their land and decorated with paper stars and strings of dried berries. They exchanged modest gifts: a knitted scarf from Hazel, a delicate silver locket from Isaac that he'd ordered specially from a catalog. "For you to keep a lock of the baby's hair," he explained as he fastened it around her neck. "And maybe someday, a picture of our family." Hazel touched the locket, tears of happiness welling in her eyes. "Our family," she repeated softly. "I love the sound of that." When spring finally arrived, melting the snow and bringing new growth to the land, Hazel was in her final month of pregnancy. Her movements had slowed, but her spirits remained high as she prepared for the baby's arrival. The garden was planted, the animals tended, and the homestead had never looked more prosperous. The baby, a boy they named Thomas Isaac Blackwood, arrived on a warm May morning after a night of labor attended by the local midwife. He had Isaac's blue eyes and a dusting of dark hair, and his lusty cries filled the cabin with new life and purpose. As Hazel held their son in her arms, with Isaac seated beside her on the bed, gazing in wonder at the tiny face, she felt a circle had been completed. The empty arms that had once symbolized her loss were now filled with the greatest gift imaginable: a child born of love that had come when she least expected it but needed it most. "He's perfect," Isaac whispered, gently touching his son's tiny hand. "Just like his mother." Hazel leaned against her husband's strong shoulder, exhausted but blissfully happy. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" Isaac asked, pressing a kiss to her temple. "For stopping to water your horse that day," she replied with a smile. "For staying when you could have gone. For loving me when I had nothing to offer but emptiness and troubles." Isaac's arms encircled her and their son, creating a sanctuary of love around them. "You had everything to offer, Hazel. You just couldn't see it then." His voice was tender as he added, "And I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you never feel empty again." As the years passed, the Blackwood homestead thrived. Isaac's careful management and Hazel's tireless work transformed it into one of the most productive small ranches in the county. The water rights agreement with Wilkes continued to provide a steady income, supplemented by the growing herd of cattle and Hazel's successful garden, which produced enough excess to sell in town. Little Thomas grew into a sturdy boy with his father's adventurous spirit and his mother's determination. He was joined 2 years later by a sister, Sarah, whose auburn hair matched Hazel's own. The barn that had risen from the ashes of Wilkes's sabotage stood strong and tall, housing not only their animals, but also Isaac's small blacksmithing operation, a skill he had cultivated over the years. His reputation for quality work spread throughout the county, bringing additional income and respect to the family. Wilkes, true to the agreement, never troubled them again. In fact, as the years passed, a grudging mutual respect developed between the cattle baron and Isaac. They would never be friends, but they had found a way to coexist that benefited them both. One summer evening, as they sat on the porch watching 7-year-old Thomas and 5-year-old Sarah chase fireflies in the gathering dusk, Hazel reached for Isaac's hand. "Are you happy?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Isaac brought her hand to his lips, kissing her palm with the same tenderness he had shown since the beginning. "More than I ever thought possible," he replied. "Every morning I wake up beside you. I count myself the luckiest man in Wyoming territory." Hazel leaned her head against his shoulder, watching their children's laughter illuminate the twilight. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if your horse hadn't picked up that stone that day?" Isaac was quiet for a moment, considering. "I believe some things are meant to be, Hazel. If not that day, then another. Our paths were destined to cross." As darkness settled over the land they had nurtured together, Hazel reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From the depths of loss and loneliness, she had found not just love, but a complete life, one filled with purpose, joy, and family. The empty arms that had once defined her grief now cradled children, embraced her husband, and built a home rich with love. And it had all begun with a dusty cowboy whose kindness had filled the emptiness when she needed it most. "I love you, Isaac Blackwood," she whispered, as the first stars appeared in the vast Wyoming sky. "And I love you," he replied, drawing her closer. "Yesterday, today, and all our tomorrows." In the distance, their children's laughter rang out, like music, the sweetest sound in a life that had overcome hardship to find its true harmony. And as Isaac's arms encircled her, Hazel knew with absolute certainty that no matter what challenges might come their way, they would face them together, their love a shelter stronger than any storm.